pleased to present him to you this afternoon. His title is Managing the Social Residues of Slavery, Slave Stigmatization and Agitation for Social Inclusion in Niger Delta, 1915 to 1945. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. I want first to thank the organizers of this very interesting and important conference. I think one of the great things about opportunities like this is that it provides a forum for discussion, which we haven't seen much of. So I'm going to make my presentation really short in the hope that there will be enough time for questions and discussion, which I think are really the essence of events like these. I'm going to speak today about something that has already come up in the earlier presentation, and it has to do with the need to talk more about the involvement of Africans themselves in the intellectual and ideological discourses relating to the demise of slavery. That issue came up in the early discussion, and that while the events of 1807 were important in their own right, there were also discourses within Africa and the African diaspora that were central to these intellectual movements towards abolition. I come from a background of human rights, history and human rights, and my concern basically is with the language of the discourse on abolition. A lot has been done on the end of slavery in this part of Africa that I'm focusing on, the Niger Delta, West Africa, Nigeria. And a lot has also been done about the issues of exclusion and marginalization in colonial slavery. But I find that much of this discussion tends to focus on the revolts, the insurrections in which Africans were involved. And these are often defined as the major contributions of Africans to the emancipation movement. And I'm not just talking about the emancipation movement before abolition, but even post-abolition emancipation movement. Missing in the narrative largely, I would say, are the intellectual and ideological contributions of Africans themselves to this whole process. As we're reminded in the earlier presentations today, the intellectual and ideological discussions about anti-slavery were not limited to white property men like Wilberforce. There was a thriving discourse, even within Africa, by ordinary Africans about the intellectual rationale for abolition and the emancipation movement. And it is that I want to speak to, how Africans themselves appropriate the emergent language of universal rights, the language of tradition, the language of culture, to articulate inclusion even after the legal abolition of slavery. In 1937, one Nicholas Nwankpele sent a petition to the resident commissioner of Ogworo in the Ogwashiku district in colonial Nigeria. And I think the language of the petition is very instructive. And I'll just read part of it because it speaks to some of the issues I'll be talking about today. And he was writing not just for himself, he was writing on behalf of a collective, of a community. It read, "We, the undersigned, representing the sons and daughters of the original inhabitants of the division of Iseluku town, designated and known as Idumo Ashaba, do hereby on behalf of ourselves and every member of the said community, resident and abroad, humbly and respectfully crave through you for the intervention of government to rid us of the opprobrious epithet Oshu, meaning slave, by which we are referred to and indicated wherever we may be in Nigeria by members of the three other quarters of Iseluku who are regarded as the ruling or loyal class. In addition to this degrading and revolting appellative, there is the restriction we bear, imposed by the Obi of some 2 centuries ago, and which is observed and scrupulously maintained, namely the prohibition of intermarriages between people in our quarter and those of the other quarters. And it goes on to articulate this. And I want you to take note of the time we're talking about. This is 1937, long after the legal abolition of slavery. So the debate and the discourse is not really about legal abolition. That has happened. From the 1900s, the colonial state had put in place the laws to legally abolish slavery. What the petitioners here were talking about was that they were asking the colonial state to go beyond legal abolition to actively enforce their reintegration into society. As Don Ohadike has rightly argued, the post-war problem of slavery in this part of Africa wasn't emancipation. It was inadequate and incomplete assimilation. And this is exactly what the Dumashaba petitioners were talking about, that there was a need to go beyond law to actively enforce their integration. And in a long span of petitions, counter-petitions, legal cases, they made these arguments before colonial officials. Another example, in 1943, there's a long petition, same Dumashaba community, but this time not by an individual, but by a group calling itself the Dumashaba Family Union. And who were these people? These people were a new class of African elites, usually clerks, civil servants in the colonial administration based in Lagos and other metropolitan cities, who were now beginning to articulate, perhaps for the first time in the language of the colonial state, an agitation for social inclusion. The other important point I just want to stress before I go to the discussion is the response from the colonial state. And I think the first paragraph in this response is very instructive. I have the honor to refer to your petition dated so-and-so and to say that you know that slavery does not exist under British rule. If anyone calls you a slave, you may at once take action in your courts against him for defamation of character and recover damages. And I think this alone speaks to what the contradiction was. To the colonial states, the abolition of slave trade, the legal abolition of slave trade, was an end in itself. The demands of the Dumashaba community and similar communities was not something the colonial state felt it needed to do. As one colonial official put it, that would only come with time, social inclusion. The state cannot decree social integration. The state cannot force individuals to enter into a contract of marriage. The state cannot be involved in such social engineering. I think what this does is that it speaks to a differing conception of what freedom is and what emancipation was. Because the colonial states saw slavery essentially as a labor system, that conception of slavery as a labor relationship tended to define how, at least at an official level, colonial